Hi, this is Sheb. Welcome to the Faith Colloquium podcast. Today my guest is Ryan Mullins. Ryan did his PhD at the University of St. Andrews, where he's also a research fellow, and he's the author of The End of the Timeless God. Ryan, thanks for talking with me.
Of course.
So Ryan, you did your PhD not only about God, as if God alone wasn't a difficult subject matter,
Right.
but God and time. So I'm curious how you got interested in this topic. What caused you to start thinking about it?
So I first got interested in this topic in high school. I think I was 17 years old, and in English class, we were asked to read C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. And as I was reading through this chapter that he has on God and time, it completely blew my mind. I mean, the idea that God could somehow transcend time, I'd never thought of such things. Yeah, and so I thought the idea of like a timeless God, that seemed to me one that was really, truly worthy of worship. And I had never felt that way before. So as I got older and studied more, I realized I want to tackle this topic. I want to know what it means to say that God is outside of time. And then I realized that it actually is connected to a whole host of issues within Christian thought. So, for instance, it seems like it has a deep impact on the way we think about the doctrine of creation, providence, prayer, and life after death. And I realized that just this whole topic of God and time then just connects to so many things in Christian theology. I just had to study further.
So you were really drawn to the idea that God transcends time or is timeless, that makes God worthy of worship.
Yeah, originally, yeah. So my PhD dissertation was called In Search of the Timeless God, because when I set out to do the PhD, I thought maybe I could find a way to salvage this doctrine. Maybe I could find a way to really make sense of it. And then I couldn't. And so I had to abandon the project.
So I think it's probably fair to say that for most of the Christian tradition, Christians have thought that God is timeless or transcends time. Do you think that's true?
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
I don't really find... I mean, you can find some people during the Reformation time period rejecting divine timelessness, but it's only a handful of people. It's not until you get to, I would think, the 20th century where you start to see a wide-scale rejection of divine timelessness.
Okay.
So it's just the overwhelming majority throughout church history have held to divine timelessness.
Okay. Yeah, and it seems like I'd say probably even your average Christian, I think, just kind of takes for granted, like, oh yeah, like of course God's outside of time, you know. So I guess I'm curious, what are some reasons why people have thought this? I mean, lots of smart people have thought this, like Augustine and Boethius. And so I'm curious, what are some reasons for thinking that God is maybe outside of time or timeless?
Well, I think we should take a step back and talk about what time is so we can understand what they mean when they say that God is timeless.
Yeah. And
then we can really start to understand their reasons. So to say that God is timeless, of course, you're rejecting time, but then you need to know what time is. And unfortunately, hardly anybody will tell you what that is. So you mentioned Augustine a minute ago, and Augustine starts out his big treatise on the nature of time. He says, I know what time is until someone asks me. Right. So yeah, I mean, so like Augustine, like he loves his jokes, but that doesn't really help a whole lot.
Sure.
Yeah. So unfortunately, most discussions in philosophy and theology and science, they focus on different aspects of time instead of what time is. And Augustine does the same thing. And so I'll just do that, because to try to tell you what time is, I'd have to go into some weird abstract theories that I'm working on at the moment that nobody else is doing.
Okay.
So I'll just tell you like two different features of the nature of time that everybody agrees on, supposedly, for the debate. So they'll say that time has this close relationship with change, such that if something changes, then it is temporal, it is in time. Because change creates a before and an after. It creates some sort of succession within objects or within the life of an object. So that's like one assumption about time.
Okay.
Yeah. Another common assumption about time is what's called presentism.
Okay.
And this is a thesis about which moments of time exist. And so Augustine says, he affirms a view called presentism, which says that only the present moment of time exists. The past no longer exists, and the future does not yet exist. Okay.
So on the first feature of time that you talked about involving change, so is this where like divine immutability comes in? So like most Christians throughout the tradition would have affirmed that God is immutable, that God doesn't change and can't change. So then it just seems to follow, right? Like, okay, then God would be outside of time as well. Is that kind of how the argument goes?
Yeah, exactly. That's one common argument. You'll give some sort of argument for God being immutable, and then you can start saying, well, look, immutability gets you changelessness, and if you're changeless, then you exist without time. Yeah, so let me tighten up the definition of divine timelessness, and then I'll get into that argument. So to say that God is timeless is to say that God exists without beginning, without end, and without succession. And the without succession part is important for understanding timelessness, because everybody wants to agree that God exists without beginning and without end, but not everyone wants to agree that God exists without succession or without change.
Okay.
So here's a kind of argument you can have for divine timelessness. So you can say something like this, and this is a really popular argument throughout most of church history, and it actually predates Christianity. So I'll call it let's call it like the argument from perfection to changelessness. And so it goes something like this. You've got two assumptions. The first assumption is that God is the greatest conceivable being, or the greatest possible being. He's absolutely perfect. And then the second assumption is that all change is for the better or worse. And so now, then you can go like, well, right, so we all agree God's perfect, absolutely perfect. He's the greatest. And everyone wants to agree on that, right? Well, unless you're an atheist and you might not like God. But we're ignoring them for the moment. We're just talking about within Christianity.
Right.
Yeah, so everybody just says God's the greatest. And now you're like, okay, well, cool. Let's look at change. All change is for the better or worse. Can God change for the better? I don't know. If he's really the greatest implies, there's nothing greater.
Right.
So it can't get better.
Right.
Yeah. So we've ruled that kind of change out from God. Well, then ask yourself, can God get worse? And it seems like, well, if he's really the greatest, he can't get worse. He's really not that perfect if you can get worse.
Right.
So now I've ruled out change for the worse within God. And now, since all change is for the better or worse, well, I've ruled out all kind of changes from God. So God can't change in any way. And if he's changeless, well, then he's timeless. Boom, done.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seems to make sense.
Yeah, there's an elegance to it. And I think that's why it's so incredibly popular throughout church history, is because it's so intuitive. It's so easy to grasp this sort of argument.
The average Christian you're encountering today, like they probably wouldn't be able to articulate it like that, right? But I think there's something to the idea that like, oh, if you're in time, you're finite and limited, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And because God knows the future and God's infinite and God's not limited, God can't be in time because time is this like constraint, right?
Right.
Yeah. Is that another kind of argument that you hear?
You can, yeah. Infinity is a tricky one. So throughout church history, you don't see a lot of theologians wanting to say that God is infinite until the later Middle Ages. Okay. You can find a few people here or there. So these arguments aren't quite as popular until the late Middle Ages. And in fact, I can even point to some different early church fathers who want to say God is not infinite because they think it comes with some really difficult or awful things you don't want to attribute to God. So these sort of infinity objections or arguments from infinity to timelessness, they come up a bit later in the late Middle Ages, but you do find them. But there's a lot of strategies of the sort. So what you're pointing out is a basic strategy of this is saying, well, I know God has this attribute, be it infinity or immutability, or you can input a whole bunch of others. He's sovereign, and then from there, since I know this other thing, this other attribute, well, there I can get timelessness from that.
Okay.
And so this is a common strategy, is to say, well, I know these other things about God, so therefore God has to be timeless.
Yeah. But you don't think these arguments work?
I don't. No. No, I really don't. So with regards to the argument from perfection to changelessness, I think that you can really question this, call this argument into question and reject it. So remember that that argument had two assumptions. One is that God is absolutely perfect and the greatest possible being. And I don't want to call that one into question. I'm very happy with that.
Yeah.
But the other one is that all changes for the better or worse. And I don't see why I should accept that. So let me give you one philosophical reason, and then I could give you a biblical reason why I don't think you should accept that.
Okay.
So here's the philosophical reason. So imagine God creates a universe that contains only two atoms, or, just two microparticles, whichever kind of particle you want, doesn't matter. And so it's just these two atoms floating in the void. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah. So these two atoms, they're sitting next to each other. And then at one moment, they're just sitting there. Then the next moment, they switch locations. And so you've got a change in the world. You've got the atoms sitting at their respective locations at the first moment, and the next moment, the atoms switch locations.
Okay.
Is anything about that better or worse?
Doesn't seem like it. It seems like it's neutral. It's just a change.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I can't find anything better or worse about this. It doesn't seem like the atoms are getting better or worse. It doesn't seem like somehow the universe as a whole is getting better or worse. So it seems to me that some changes are just value neutral. It's just false that all changes are for the better or worse. So the argument, I think, cannot get up and running because one of its key premises is just false.
Okay. So what about classic categories of potentiality and actuality that we get from Aristotle, and that, okay, like these two particles, they've changed, but that if there's a change, that means that there's a potentiality. And so that is what we don't like. That's what we wouldn't want to put into God, this kind of potentiality, because we want him to be purely actual.
Oh, right. Yeah. So there's some more assumptions buried in there as well. So the idea is that there's a couple ways to cut this. So one way might be to say actuality has more existence than potentiality.
Right.
And in one sense, I understand what that means, which is if I look at merely possible things compared to actual existent things that actually exist have more value than the merely potential things, because only things that actually exist have value, right?
Yeah.
But when I look at some being that has a power, and a power is sort of this potential, this active potency to actualize things, well, it's an actually existent being that actually has the power, and that power is the ability to actualize states of affairs. And so it seems like that's I've got all these things that actually exist. So if God is actualizing his power, he's exercising it, but it's not like he's adding more existence to himself, whatever that means. And I honestly don't know what that means to say adding existence to yourself. So some of my intuitions, some of those initial intuitions I have with Aristotle, I'm like, that seems kind of plausible. I start to lose my grasp on that really fast.
So it sounds like you're saying like the important thing is that he can just do things. Yeah, to like make particles and make them move and things like this. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and that seems a great making property, like something that makes God perfect is having this absolute power. It's not the actualization of it that makes God better or perfect. It's having that power is what makes God perfect. Okay,
so you've given me your philosophical reason for why change doesn't seem to necessarily be better or worse. What's your biblical reason?
Right. So the biblical reason is really straightforward. It's just like if you read the Bible, God's changing all the time, right? I mean, he's not doing anything, and then he creates a universe. He's not interacting with Moses, and then all of a sudden he walks up to Moses. He's like, "Hey, Moses, I want to do something pretty amazing here. Let's do this whole Exodus thing. That sounds great."
Yeah.
He's not always incarnate, and then he becomes incarnate, and those are all new moments in the life of God.
What about these Bible passages where God says things like, "I don't change"?
Right. Yeah, these are great. So you've got three different ones. There's one in 1 Samuel. I think the other instance is in Numbers, the book of Numbers, and then another one's in Malachi chapter 3. Yeah, and so they say that God does not change, but it will exercise. It says God is not a man that he should change his mind,
right,
is what it says. Yeah, and so I think it's really important to keep a close eye on which respects does God not change. And so a lot of Old Testament scholars, like Robert Moberly, will say, look, when you look at these passages, what you see is a really, really specific respect with which God does not change. And the context is usually something like this. Men, human beings, they're liars. They make promises, they don't keep them.
Okay.
God's not like that. He is not a liar. He's not a man that he's, in that way. Men are liars, they don't keep their promises. God's pretty great. He's going to keep his promises.
So these passages are maybe referring more to like God's like faithfulness, his like steadfast,
exactly,
his steadfastness or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
And so I think this is really important when you see other passages like Hosea chapter 11. It uses the same idea that God is really faithful and that God always keeps his promises. And so when you look at Hosea 11, you see a very different claim. You see God does change precisely because he is not a man. And the change there is, well, look, human beings, they are really stubborn people. And when they're angry, they don't want to forgive anyone. They don't have compassion. They don't have mercy. But what is God like? God's not like that at all. God is not a stubborn man who refuses to change his plan of wrath to a plan of forgiveness. Instead, God has compassion, so God will change his plan of wrath to a plan of forgiveness precisely because he's not a stubborn man. And so that God's faithfulness to his promises is the underlying key here, is this underlying theme.
Yeah. I mean, and then in the incarnation, it seems like it's really difficult to avoid it. It's like we clearly have a state, it seems like a state where the second person of the Trinity is pre-incarnate and then is incarnate.
Right. Yeah. Because and that's actually written into a lot of the early church creeds when they're articulating the doctrine. And the early church fathers talk about he became incarnate. There was a time when he was not incarnate.
Yeah.
The Son of God was always eternal, always existed, but he wasn't always connected to this human nature because that human nature didn't always exist.
Right.
He became, and he in some sense became connected to the human nature at some point in time.
So what do you think about this response that I think some Christians throughout the tradition have said, well, God doesn't have any kind of real relations to the world. The world changes and we might change in relationship to God, but God doesn't. God's relations aren't kind of real relations in interacting with us.
Yeah, this is weird stuff. See if we can try to explain this a bit better for the listeners.
Yeah.
So a real relation is when I'm standing in relation to something, say like you. So we're talking, and we each have an accidental property, something that's not essential to us, that we have in virtue of standing in this relationship. So I have the property of talking to you, and you have the property of being talked at. And so we both have these properties because we're both in this relationship. So it's a real relationship. And we wouldn't have these properties if we were not in this particular talking and being talked at relationship.
Okay.
Whereas like there's other relationships that supposedly on, like Aristotelian ways of thinking are not real, such as, and here's a common example, is I'm thinking about Socrates. Well, nothing about Socrates changes supposedly while I'm thinking about Socrates, because it's just a relationship that exists in my head. Mm-hmm. So it's not a relationship that's actually existing out there in the world between two or more things. Right. And so the idea is somehow this helps us understand God's relationship to the universe. And so the claim you see from like Augustine and Boethius and Peter Lombard and Thomas Aquinas and so many others is that there's this sort of what's called like a mixed relationship. Okay. So I am really related to God, but God is not really related to me. Yeah. Which means I'm really related to God because I have the property of being created by God. So it's a property I actually have. Yeah. Whereas the relationship between God and me, well, God doesn't have any properties by being related to me. He doesn't have the property of creator or redeemer or judge of all men or anything like that. And instead, those are supposed to be more like those relationships of reason that exist in my head only. Right. And that just seems weird. That doesn't seem right. It seems to me that when I say God's creator, I'm not talking about some relationship that exists just in my head, like when I'm talking about Socrates. It seems like, no, that's a real relationship. Like God wouldn't be creator unless God created a universe. Yeah. God would not be the redeemer unless God actually did something to redeem humanity. Yeah. So those have to be something stronger than just relations of reason. Yeah. So I'm curious. So like, I mean, again, there have been reasons why these thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas have wanted to like make those moves, right? Right, yeah. And I'm wondering if you think that this is like if there's some kind of like elevating like philosophical principles over the biblical revelation, like if that's what you would say, or just how you would explain that, because for a long time they have said like, yeah, God doesn't have properties. It's really important that he doesn't have properties, right? And all these things. So yeah, I'm just curious, like what you think of all that. I do think it is elevating philosophy or scripture, but I don't think it's intentional on their part.
Yeah.
Because I think they'll be uncharitable because they are reading their Bibles. They're trying to be faithful.
Yeah.
And if anybody sits down and reads, like, say, Augustine, you see him considering lots of philosophical schools of thought. And he's trying to say, Christians, we can agree with this school of thought on these issues, but not others. And you'll see him try to really critically engage which philosophical assumptions he wants to adopt. But with regards to things like timelessness or immutability, the overall picture of God, it's not really, I don't think that's fully critically examined in the early church. I think that's something that the idea of God changing, the idea of God being temporal, these are things that are just off the table. The idea that God could suffer, that's just off the table. Like, nobody even wants to consider that at all in the early church. So I think the idea would be something like this. The best science of the day, the best philosophy of the day is telling me God is like this. And so when I come to scripture, I have to figure out how do I interpret scripture in a way that's consistent with what the best philosophy, the best science of the day is telling me.
Sure.
So I don't want to say it's like they're just elevating philosophy over it. I think they're trying to critically engage these things, but I don't think they saw other options that were on the table as live options.
Yeah, that's well said. Okay, so you've given us these two reasons to reconsider that change doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing.
Right.
So once you got that, then it seems like that opens the door to the fact that God may have succession.
Right.
Okay. And is that all? Is that it? Is that all you need to do to make the argument then?
Sort of. Because there's lots of other problems that might come up. Okay. But yeah, that's one of the biggest things I think that matters for saying, is God temporal? Is God in time? Or does God have succession? And I think one of the main reasons for saying that is, look, if God creates the universe out of nothing, you've got a state of affairs where God's not doing anything, and then God does something.
Yeah.
He brings the universe into existence, and then he interacts with it, and then he does this, and then he does that. Yeah. And so I think it's really intuitive to say that God has succession just in virtue of the fact that God performs actions, listens to prayers, responds to them, just a give and take in his relationship with creation.
Yeah. What do you think about this argument? So as a human being that exists in time, there are times in my life that I really enjoyed, and I no longer live in those moments, right? Mm-hmm. And it would be strange to think of God looking back at his life and thinking like, oh, I wish I could go back to that time or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And a perfect being, like the greatest conceivable being, would be able to like have the fullness of his life like all together. He wouldn't be like losing parts of his life or something like this. What do you think of an argument like that?
Yeah, so let's put some more teeth on the bones of this argument so we can kind of feel the force of it a bit more. So earlier I mentioned to you that the classical tradition assumed presentism about the nature of time.
Yeah.
The present is the only moment that exists. And so what you're talking about when you're saying like, oh, these moments that like I really wish I could get back, on presentism, those moments just cease to exist.
Right.
Right, because they're past. And so do we really want to say about that about God? And so this is where you see someone like Boethius, who defends divine timelessness, saying, well, look, God exists in a timeless present that lacks a before and after, that lacks succession. So God enjoys his life all at once.
Yeah.
Well, the enjoying life all at once, he's not talking about moments of time. He's actually saying something about a theory of persistence through time there. Okay. So one way to try to attack the argument is to say, you're misunderstanding what the enjoying his life all at once means. So here's the idea. When you persist through time, I want to know, you might ask a question like this, be like, well, how many Ryans are there that exist? And I want to answer to you, there's only one Ryan.
Yeah.
Why? Because I have this thing called endurance.
Yeah. I
endure through time in that there's just one thing that's me. And I exist as a whole or all at once at whichever moments I exist.
Yeah.
And I am this thing that exists as a whole or all at once at each moment.
Right.
So Christians throughout history have said the same thing about God. They're like, yeah, God is an endurant being as well. He exists as a whole because there's one thing that's God. So he exists as a whole or all at once at whatever moments he exists. Which moments does he exist at? Well, just the timeless moment. Because he's not temporal. So he doesn't exist at temporal moments. He just exists at this timeless moment. So they're making a statement about persistence or identity with the life all at once. So when I get clear on that, then it's hard for me to see what some of the force is here. Because, if God only has one moment, Well, of course he exists as a whole at that moment. And is he enjoying his life at the moment? Well, I guess.
Yeah.
But it's impossible for there to be other moments, and they're not temporal moments.
Right.
Yeah. So I kind of lose my grasp on it.
Yeah.
But here's another way to do it, though. It's much more easy, I think.
Okay.
Is to just say, well, it would be nice to have those past moments, but it's just impossible to get them back. That's just the nature of performing actions and time. Okay. Is that when you do something, it changes the way the world is, and you can't go back to it.
Okay.
So it's just impossible for any being whatsoever to gain those past moments. So even a timeless God, if God wanted to have some of those moments that cease to exist, that take place within time, if God wanted those to come back, he can't bring them back. They're gone.
Okay.
So it just doesn't matter. It's just impossible. You're asking God to do something impossible. And I'm like, yeah, God can't do impossible things. Oh, well.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I'm curious then what this means for Christians who are just living their lives. Like how would my belief that God, say, is not timeless change the way that I live my Christian life?
Well, so let me give you like a kind of like cheeky response, and then like a more real response.
Yeah.
So like the sort of cheeky response I want to say is it doesn't really change anything. And here's why. Because nobody, including professional theologians, like nobody consistently thinks about God in terms of timelessness and changelessness, because that's just really hard to do.
Yeah.
So most people who think God is timeless, they are thinking of God in terms of I pray, God hears, and then God responds. They're thinking of God as a temporal being.
Yeah.
You know, but that's just because we all have incoherent beliefs. So like the fact that people would say God's timeless, but then think in terms of God having, new moments in his life, just
right.
Yeah. We all have incoherent beliefs because it's really hard to think coherently.
Yeah.
So in one sense, this debate wouldn't change anything because people are already believing as if God is temporal anyway.
Sure.
Yeah, they're just unwittingly adopting my view. So good for me. But,
Right.
But like on a more like serious note, though, doctrines like timelessness, they come with a package deal of other attributes like immutability that we've talked about already. And also an attribute called impassibility, or the claim that God cannot suffer or be influenced or be affected by anything outside of himself.
Yeah.
And the idea is like, well, look, if God could be influenced or affected, then God would undergo change in succession. So if I pray to God and that somehow influences God, I mean, like that's there's a moment where God's not being influenced and then he is being influenced. And so you've got change in God. And the classical tradition says, no, we don't want that.
Mm-hmm.
And so think about that for a second, though. The idea that I cannot influence this timeless God. Mm-hmm. So whatever God is timelessly doing, that's just eternally settled. And like your life, your actions, whatever you do, that has no influence on God's decision-making process.
Yeah, it's not comforting, I suppose, to think that.
Right.
Yeah.
Like why like I don't know about you, but like why would you want to pray to such a being?
Yeah.
It might seem really pointless to try to praise someone like that.
And it seems to like to go against at least some like scriptural data that people pray and do influence how God acts as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's some interpretational moves you can try to make to make it look like you're not really influencing God, to say like, well, look, God knows the future. Yeah. And so he already knew you were going to pray.
Right.
But that's actually looking at time in a very weird way, because they're looking as if you still have some kind of influence on there and that God's somehow changing the future. So they're making some weird assumptions there that I don't think are consistent. But the big idea, though, is that still like your prayer cannot influence God.
Yeah.
Whatever God's decided, he's decided.
Yeah.
And that's that.
Right.
But, maybe you could say something like this, though, in response to be like, well, Ryan, that's I can't influence God in my prayer, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't pray. The point when I pray isn't to change God, it's to be changed by God.
Right. That's a common way of thinking about prayer.
Yeah. And I mean, C.S. Lewis does the same thing. When he looks at, he has a paper called The Efficacy of Prayer, and he asks this, like, God knows the future. Well, why would I pray? And he's like, so that you can be changed. That's why.
Yeah.
And I think that's right. I think that there's a lot of prayers that a lot of times when you're praying, you are trying to figure out what God's will is. You are trying to figure out who you need to become in order to change in light of God.
Right.
But I think there's a deeper worry here in the neighborhood. So I can say, all right, I'll grant you that maybe prayer isn't always about trying to change God. But what about my worship, though? Do I really want to worship a God that cannot possibly be affected or influenced by me. Because it seems like my worship should matter to God.
Right.
Like maybe God would care.
Right.
But it's hard to see how God could possibly care if God can't be influenced or affected or impacted in any way by my worship.
Yeah.
It seems like it doesn't make a single difference to God.
Yeah. So like whether I existed or not, or said the things I said, God is who God is.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm quite happy to say that like God is who God is in the following sense. Like nothing I am or do makes God loving, or makes God eternal, or or makes God the kind of being that He is.
Yeah.
But I want to say that something I am or something that I do influences the way that God exercises His character, exercises His attributes.
Yeah.
So like if I sin, it seems like nothing about me sinning entails that God is just or not just. I mean, God is a just God no matter what, but how He exercises His justice, well, that's going to depend on what I do. If I'm sinning, then hopefully He's going to, dish out a little bit of justice.
Yeah.
And if I repent, well, God's loving and merciful and compassionate. Nothing I can do makes God loving or merciful or compassionate. But if I repent, then the way God exercises His mercy seems like that's going to be influenced by something I do.
Right. Yeah. So it seems like it really does have a lot of implications for how you, even at least like what we're talking about now, how you pray.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it seems like, if I really do think that God is the kind of being who cares about me, who interacts with me, who listens to me and is trying to respond to me in loving ways, then it seems like you might want to get rid of some of these more traditional understandings that God is completely and utterly changeless or completely unaffected by what happens in the world.
Yeah. So usually when I bring up this idea of God being not timeless, that maybe God exists in time with my philosophy students, their immediate concern is like, well, then how does God know the future? Right. It seems like God knows the future because God's outside of time and God kind of like looks at everything. Right. God sees everything happening. But if you're in time, you don't have that kind of perspective.
Right.
But it seems like the Bible makes these claims that God does know the future.
Right.
So if you put God in time, He loses that kind of foreknowledge, I suppose.
Supposedly.
Yeah.
So this is things get tricky here. And I can tell you what different people say. I don't know how to think about this yet.
Okay.
So here's the traditional claim. So the traditional claim is that God sees all of time at once, but they're speaking metaphorically there because they're committed to presentism. So only the present moment exists. So the future is not literally there for God to see.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so it's only as if God is seeing all moments of time at once.
Okay.
So it's a metaphor.
Right.
Here's the literal claim that's lying underneath it. God's knowledge is based purely on an understanding of His own essence. And so Augustine looks at these kind of issues and he says, well, God can't be getting knowledge through testimony. God can't be getting knowledge through like perception, like through the external world. So the only thing left is self-knowledge.
Right.
So God has a perfect knowledge of Himself and somehow knows everything.
Yeah. Like, so God knows Himself perfectly, and that's all He needs to know.
Yeah.
For all these other things to follow.
Supposedly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so before I get into some more technical things of that, you might say this. Well, if that's all it takes for God to know everything, supposedly, somehow knowing the future, it doesn't matter that the future actually exists. All you need is that God just has a perfect knowledge of Himself. Well, if God's in time, then it doesn't matter whether or not the future exists and whether or not God's seeing it, because nobody historically thought God was literally seeing it. It's only until the 20th century, after Einstein, where you see people adopting theories of time where the future literally exists and God's literally seeing it.
Yeah, yeah.
So if I'm looking at just historical accounts of divine timelessness, then the timelessness stuff, it's not actually doing anything with regards to God knowing the future.
Yeah. That's helpful to point out that view of like the future actually existing. I suppose that's connected to four dimensionalism.
Yeah.
It's not like the fathers would have thought about that.
Yeah, because when you see their early church fathers, like Augustine, let's go with him again. He looks at this question of how do prophets know the future? And he's like, ooh, gosh, I really don't know. Because the future doesn't exist. So it's not like the prophets are literally seeing it.
Right, right.
And so when then he turns to God, he says, same thing. It's not God's literally seeing it.
Yeah.
But you do still get a lot of problems related to there, though. So the problem of if the future doesn't actually exist, how does God know it? That's a problem, I think, for everyone, timelessness and temporality. Because if you don't think that God's knowledge of himself is enough to get you knowledge of the future, then that's a problem for, I think, everybody, regardless of what you think about God, God's relationship to time.
That's interesting. Okay. So if you held on to four-dimensionalism then, or like if you denied, let's say, presentism, then would it solve the problem?
Maybe.
Okay.
So on this four-dimensionalism, or what's called eternalism, the view is that all moments of time exist.
Right.
So the past, what we call past, present, and future, they just do exist.
Right.
But strictly speaking, there is no future. That's just relative from some perspective within time.
Right. For us, it's 2019, but that just happens to be our vantage point.
Yeah.
For people in like 2040, like we're in the past, right?
Correct. So we're past for them, but their future relative to us. So the past and present and future, these are all relative terms. There's not objective terms if we're going to adopt this eternalist or this four-dimensionalist picture of time. And so in that sense, then you could say God knows the future, but strictly speaking, he doesn't, because there is no future. What you're saying is God, I guess you could say, literally perceives the entire timeline because it's all there. It literally exists for God to see.
Right.
So it gets you God's knowledge of later times and earlier times, but it doesn't really get you foreknowledge in any interesting kind of way that would help with, say, providence, because all those moments, they're settled. What happens at those moments just is happening. Yeah, right. And so God can't change it.
Right. It seems like it would open another can of theological worms where you've got things like sin just kind of like persisting.
Yeah.
And claims that God makes about like, I will vanquish evil, I will vanquish Satan, things like this. It's difficult to see how that makes sense on this view.
Right, because what you have on this view is like this entire block of time is co-eternal with God.
Right.
So on this view, there's never a state of affairs where God exists without this block of time. And so on certain blocks of the time, there's evil existing, and Satan's got control of something supposedly, and all the atrocities that have happened through human history, they're all occurring at their respective times.
Yeah.
And then later on down the timeline, God could see, well, there's some really great stuff happening here. The resurrection of the dead, everyone's enjoying the new creation. Maybe there's some beatific vision stuff going on. Now, that seems really cool. Yeah. But all that other stuff in the earlier parts of the block of time, those still exist. They're still co-eternal with God, and they're really awful, and they're really ugly.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that doesn't seem right.
It feels kind of gross. If you really think God's defeating evil, then you could rightly ask, well, you didn't do that good of a job because it's still co-eternal with you.
Yeah,
what kind of defeat is that?
Yeah, right. So is there work being done on this that you feel like that might be the way to work through this foreknowledge piece?
Yeah, this is tricky. So there's a view that I really quite like called Mullinism, that God has middle knowledge.
Yeah.
And so the big idea is something like this. So imagine you are a Hollywood big shot movie producer, and you're looking at all the movies you could possibly create. And so you're sitting on your desk are like a whole bunch of copies of different scripts of movies you could possibly create. And so you're looking through all these scripts, and they're the scripts that give you a complete detail of how the movie would be made. And supposedly, and you look through them and say, well, that one looks nice, but it's just not feasible. Like, I couldn't make it, there's something incoherent about the movie story or something like that. And on middle knowledge, the idea is like God's got all these movie scripts there, and he can select which one he wants to actually create. He finds one that's feasible, and he selects it and then starts making it happen in some interesting kind of way that still gives us free will, supposedly. But there's this objection called the grounding objection, which asks what makes those movie scripts true before God creates one.
Right.
And the objections there are really serious, and some of the responses are interesting, but I really worry about how good some of the responses are at the moment.
Okay. Okay. So here's my actual last question.
Okay.
I can hear all my classical theist friends just saying something like, okay, what you described, Ryan, is you've just made God to be like a really impressive creature, right?
Yeah.
He's like one of us, basically. He's like this like human being with all these kind of superpowers, essentially, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And that's not how we want to think about God. We want to think about God as like the foundation of all reality. So I'm curious what you would say in response to that.
Yeah, I've never seen a version of this argument that I find remotely persuasive. Like they all look like straw men to me. So even though I'm not an open theist, like I'll see the sort of objections. They'll say, well, the God of open theism is just a creature.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, so it's this being that necessarily exists, that necessarily has omniscience and omnipotence and perfect goodness and perfect freedom. And is the sole reason that anything contingent exists. That's a really impressive creature. I don't know what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So like, if you say that God changes, that doesn't somehow make God not the foundation of all of existence. All it takes for God to be the foundation of all of reality is that God's a necessarily existent being, God's necessarily omnipotent, and he's the thing that causes all this other stuff to exist. So I don't, if there's something else like to try to push, like to make the objection work, I'm open to hear it, but at the moment it just sounds like a caricature.
Okay. That's good. That's helpful. Ryan, thanks for talking with me.
Of course. Yeah. Anytime.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe and please share with your friends.